Ethan Caldwell, billionaire CEO of Pinnacle Enterprises, leaned back in his leather chair high above Chicago's skyline, and with a laugh as sharp as broken glass, he spat out words that froze everyone in the room. "A janitor's son claims he speaks 9 languages? Don't insult my intelligence." That cruel laugh echoed across the marble floor of the 60th floor penthouse, where million-dollar paintings hung like trophies of power, and the boy standing before him looked impossibly small. But before we go any further, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story. And hit that like button, because what happens next will shock you more than anything that happened in this penthouse. The boy's name was Jamal Torres, only 14 years old, wearing a hand-me-down shirt that hung loose on his narrow frame. His mother, Maria, stood quietly behind him, the woman who had scrubbed these very marble floors for 10 years, invisible in the eyes of the powerful men who passed over her as though she were a shadow. Ethan Caldwell looked at Jamal not with curiosity, not with the interest one might give to a prodigy, but with contempt, with the disbelief of a man who had lived his entire life in the comfort of wealth and could not imagine greatness rising from anywhere beneath him. 9 languages, Ethan repeated with mockery, tilting his golden pen between his fingers. "I doubt you can even spell them, let alone speak them. Let's see how your little fantasy holds up." He snapped his fingers, and Victor Langston, a board member with cold ambition flickering in his eyes, stepped forward carrying a manuscript wrapped in delicate cloth. The boardroom had never seen anything like it before. It was a relic Ethan had bought for show, a 1,000-year-old manuscript written not in 1 but in 9 ancient tongues: Old Japanese, Akkadian, Coptic, Aramaic, Old Norse, Pali, Ge'ez, Latin, and Sanskrit. He held it like a weapon, certain it would humiliate the boy who dared to stand in front of him. "Read this," Ethan ordered, tossing the fragile pages onto the oak table as though they were nothing. Gasps rose from the assistants lining the wall. Even the scholars Ethan had once hired to decode it had failed. "If you truly speak 9 languages, show us, or admit you're nothing more than a janitor's son playing games." Maria stepped forward, her hands trembling. But Jamal lifted his chin, his eyes, dark and steady, met Ethan's. "You think being poor makes me less," he said softly, but firmly. "But money doesn't prove intelligence. Knowledge can come from anywhere, even from the children you ignore." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Ethan's smirk. "Prove it." Then, Jamal touched the manuscript as though it were alive. He began with Old Japanese, his voice calm, carrying syllables that rolled like waves. He shifted into Akkadian, a language dead for thousands of years, yet rising from his mouth as though it had never gone silent. The assistants leaned forward, phones forgotten in their hands, as he moved into Coptic, then Aramaic, then Norse, each translation flowing like a river changing course, but never losing strength. He finished in Sanskrit, the words sounding almost like prayer, when he lifted his head, his eyes locked on Ethan, and his voice did not shake. The message says this: "Humility is the only crown worth wearing. Power is empty if it cannot lift others. A man who cannot see the dignity of those who serve him will soon be blind to his own worth." Ethan's laughter died in his throat. For a long moment he could not speak, and in that silence the weight of Jamal's words hung heavy, not just in the air but in the conscience of everyone present. Maria's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of pride, as she saw her son stand tall in a place designed to crush him, but in the shadows. Victor Langston's lips curled into a smile, not of admiration but of calculation. He had seen opportunity in this moment. To him, Jamal was not a miracle, but a weapon. something he could twist to humiliate Ethan and seize more power for himself. And so, even as Jamal stood victorious, Victor quietly snapped a photo, already composing the leak that would set social media ablaze and turn this private humiliation into a public storm. Yet Jamal knew nothing of Victor's scheme. What he knew was the trembling in his mother's hands and the mocking glare still etched in Ethan's face. "You're just a boy," Ethan finally muttered, trying to recover. But even he knew the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The assistants whispered among themselves. Phones buzzed with messages. And Maria, for the first time in a decade, raised her head and looked at the man who had ignored her existence for so long. She saw not a titan of industry, but a man suddenly uncertain. That night would mark the beginning of a struggle that would reach far beyond the walls of Pinnacle Enterprises. Jamal had planted a seed in the heart of arrogance, and though it was met with scorn, it would grow into something larger than any of them could yet imagine. For now, though, all that remained in the penthouse was a boy, a mother, a billionaire, and a silence so deep it felt like history had just changed course. The next morning, Ethan Caldwell, billionaire of marble towers and glass offices, found himself walking into a place he had never once set foot in, the South Side branch of the Chicago Public Library. The marble under his feet was gone, replaced by scratched wooden floors, the air faint with the smell of old books and dust, the hum of fluorescent lights flickering in uneven rhythm. For a man used to mahogany desks and million-dollar views of Lake Michigan, this small branch with chipped paint and donated furniture felt like stepping into another world, a world he had spent his life ignoring, and yet, standing beside him with a backpack slung over one shoulder. Jamal Torres looked more at home here than Ethan ever had in his kingdom of steel. Maria, his mother, stayed near the entrance, her uniform still wrinkled from a night shift, watching carefully as her son guided a man who had once mocked him. At the far end of the room sat two figures who did not look like scholars in the way Ethan had imagined. Professor Okoye, once a Nigerian academic, now drove an Uber to make ends meet. Madame Leclerc, a Haitian refugee, taught French to children for free in the evenings. They rose when Jamal led Ethan to them, not with deference to his wealth, but with respect for the moment about to unfold. "This is Ethan," Jamal said, his young voice carrying an authority beyond his years. "He came to learn." Ethan cleared his throat, uncomfortable, tugging at the sleeve of his tailored jacket. "Yes. Well, I suppose I'll give it a try," he muttered. But even as he spoke, he felt the eyes of every library patron upon him, the immigrant father helping his daughter with homework, the teenage boy flipping through Spanish flashcards, the elderly woman tracing words with her finger. Here, in this small space, titles meant nothing. Okoye handed Ethan a sheet of paper filled with Japanese characters. "Read this," he said simply. Ethan squinted, the symbols swimming before his eyes. He tried to guess, but his tongue stumbled, the sounds clumsy. A chuckle rippled through the room, not cruel, but human, and Ethan's face flushed. Jamal sat beside him. "Calm. It's all right," he said, his voice gentle. "You start with sounds, then rhythm. Language isn't conquered. Mr. Caldwell, it's shared." For the next hour, Ethan struggled. He mispronounced vowels. He confused symbols. He grew frustrated. Each mistake felt heavier than the last, not because the boy corrected him, but because the boy did so with patience. Never mockery, never arrogance, the very opposite of how Ethan had treated him the night before. Slowly, Ethan began to feel something he had not felt in years: humility. When Madame Leclerc asked him to repeat a French phrase, he faltered. "Je suis désolé." He stumbled. The words meant to say, "I am sorry." The phrase hung in the air like a confession. And Maria. hearing it from across the room, felt something shift in her chest. She had cleaned his offices for years without hearing her own name spoken. And now this man, this billionaire who had dismissed her son, was learning the very words he had never given her. Again. Madame Leclerc urged, Ethan repeated, and this time his voice did not tremble. But while Ethan struggled to sound out the syllables of humility, another struggle was already forming beyond the library walls. Victor Langston had leaked the footage of the penthouse confrontation to a blog known for sensational headlines. By noon, the story was spreading online. A billionaire mocked by a janitor's son who claimed to speak 9 languages. But Victor spun it differently. He whispered to reporters that Ethan was using the boy for a publicity stunt, a desperate attempt to clean his tarnished image. Trolls filled the comment sections, mocking Jamal, calling him names, questioning his intelligence, attacking Maria for daring to raise her head. Phones buzzed, threats slipped through the cracks of digital hate, and by the time Jamal walked home that evening, his mother found an anonymous message scrawled on their apartment door. Library boy, stay where you belong. Maria wanted to call the police, but Jamal shook his head. If I let them silence me, then they win. She looked at her son, so young yet carrying a weight too heavy, and she realized this was no longer about languages or manuscripts. It was about dignity, about proving that their voices mattered. The next day, Ethan returned to the library, this time without his jacket, sleeves rolled, ready to fail again and again. The regulars began to nod at him, not because he was rich, but because he showed up. Jamal sat across from him, correcting gently, never condescending. Okoye told stories of driving passengers who never once looked him in the eye. Yet here he was teaching a billionaire how to sound out words. Madame Leclerc shared how she had fled her homeland with nothing but a book, and how language had kept her alive. Ethan listened, really listened. And for the first time in his adult life, he realized that knowledge was not an asset to own, but a gift to share. Maria sat quietly in the back, her heart swelling as she watched her son not just translate words but build bridges. Yet shadows still lingered. Each day, new headlines painted Ethan as a manipulator, Jamal as a pawn, the library as a circus. The pressure mounted, and Victor's smirk grew wider as protests began forming outside, but inside the modest wooden walls. A different story was unfolding. Ethan, once the voice of scorn, now stumbled through consonants like a child, and Jamal, once dismissed as invisible, guided him like a teacher, and though the world outside was sharpening its knives, within those walls, humility began to take root. The storm broke 2 weeks later at a public colloquium inside the library's cramped main hall. A gathering meant to showcase the power of language, but quickly becoming a battlefield of pride, prejudice, and fear. Folding chairs filled every corner, the air thick with chatter as community members, scholars, students, and even reporters crammed together to witness the boy who claimed mastery of 9 tongues. Jamal sat at a simple wooden table, the same manuscript that Ethan had once tossed in mockery, now resting before him like a sacred trust. Maria stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly, watching her son with the quiet strength only a mother knows, while Ethan sat beside her, nervous in a way no boardroom had ever made him, at the front. Professor Okoye and Madame Leclerc opened the session, introducing Jamal not as a curiosity, not as a stunt, but as a student who had chosen to stand for something larger than himself. Words build bridges, Okoye said, his voice deep and steady, and bridges are most needed where walls have been raised. The audience hushed as Jamal began. His fingers brushed the ancient pages, and then his voice rose, weaving sounds from the past into the present. He spoke Coptic first, each syllable flowing with a grace that startled even seasoned scholars. He explained how the words held not just meaning but memory, fragments of a people who refused to vanish. Then he shifted into Aramaic, the language of prophets, his tone carrying echoes of deserts and prayers long forgotten. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, phones lifted to record, and Maria saw pride spreading across faces that had once dismissed her son. But as Jamal's voice rose, the doors outside rattled with a different kind of noise. Protesters, stirred by Victor Langston's online campaign, gathered with signs calling Jamal a fraud, calling Ethan a manipulator, shouting that the library was wasting taxpayer money. Some voices were laced with racism, others with blind anger, all of them fueled by Victor's whispers. Inside. Jamal did not falter. He shifted into Old Norse, explaining how words of warriors carried not only battles, but codes of honor. Then into Ge'ez, painting stories of ancient Ethiopia. Then Latin, its rhythm sharp and clear. Every tongue he touched became more than a language. It became a mirror held to the crowd, showing them that knowledge belonged to no single race, no single class, no single generation. But just as he began to read in Sanskrit, a crash split the air. A brick, hurled through the side window, shattered glass across the floor, shards scattering like cruel confetti. Gasps erupted, chairs scraped, someone screamed. Maria threw herself toward her son, shielding him, while Ethan rose with fury blazing in his eyes. For a moment it seemed chaos would consume the room, but Jamal lifted his voice above the shouts, calm, steady, unbroken. He continued reading the Sanskrit verse as if the brick had never touched the building. His voice cut through fear like a bell through fog. Truth is not silenced by stones. Dignity is not erased by hate. The path of learning does not end at broken glass. The crowd froze, as if the boy's courage had bound them all in a single breath. Even those who had doubted him felt something shift. Jamal lowered the manuscript, looked directly at the protesters outside the broken window, and spoke in English, clear and unwavering. You can throw bricks at windows, but you cannot break words. You can insult my mother, but you cannot erase her strength. If you came here angry, then stay and listen and ask me questions. Challenge me, but do not silence me. This is a library. This is where voices are meant to be heard. Silence followed, heavy, electric. Then an elderly man in the front row, a retired teacher, stood and began to clap, one by one. Others joined until the room shook not with shouts of hatred, but with applause that drowned them out. Even some protesters lowered their signs, uncertain now, disarmed not by force, but by a boy's composure. Ethan watched with awe, his arrogance from weeks earlier replaced by humility, realizing that this child had more command of a room than he ever had with millions at his back. Maria wept openly, no longer caring who saw. Victor Langston, however, seethed in the shadows. He had expected chaos to bury Jamal, but instead the chaos had revealed his strength. Still, Victor was not done. That evening, as the applause spread into headlines, Ethan Caldwell announced a decision that stunned even his closest advisors. From the podium, glass shards still glittering at his feet, he declared the creation of the Jamal Torres Foundation for Equity, seeded with $750 million, its mission to expand libraries, fund education, and elevate voices too long ignored. And, Ethan added, turning toward Maria, its first CEO will not be me, but the woman who taught her son dignity by example, Maria Torres. Gasps swept the room, reporters scrambled, and Maria shook her head in disbelief, but Ethan pressed on. This family has taught me what I never learned in boardrooms. It is time I use my wealth not to boast, but to build. The announcement lit a fire across the city. Some praised Ethan for humility, others mocked him for weakness, but no one could ignore it. Jamal's name trended online, his face appearing on news segments, his words replayed on radio stations. Yet behind the spotlight, the boy himself walked quietly home with his mother, holding her hand, whispering that everything he did was for her. For the years she had bent her back unseen, Maria, exhausted yet proud, knew that storms would only grow stronger, and indeed, they would. Victor was already planning his next strike, reaching out to shareholders, plotting to frame Ethan as reckless. But for that single night, as the brick dust settled and the applause echoed in memory, Jamal had turned hatred into dialogue, fear into courage, and humiliation into hope. He had stood in broken glass and proved that dignity could not be shattered. Fame came fast, but so did cruelty. And for Jamal Torres, it arrived not in the form of applause, but in the jeers of his classmates the morning after the foundation was announced. His locker, once just a dented piece of metal in the corner of the hall, was plastered with slurs scrawled in marker, words that cut deeper than the brick that had shattered the library window. And as he stood frozen in front of the graffiti, whispers spread down the corridor. There goes the library kid, Mr. Nine Tongues. Think he's smarter than the rest of us. Some voices mocking, some filled with envy, others simply cruel for the sake of cruelty. Jamal closed his eyes, drawing the same steady breath he had used in the colloquium, but this time there was no crowd to applaud, no scholars to nod in respect, only teenagers with phones pointed at him, recording his humiliation. Maria wanted to storm into the school that very afternoon, to demand that the principal erase every mark and suspend every student responsible. But Jamal stopped her with a quiet plea. If I let their hate define me, then I lose everything I've worked for. Let me fight this my way. And so he fought not with fists, but with words, alongside his shy but brilliant friend Aisha Jackson, the girl who spent evenings coding on a borrowed laptop. He began a language club after school, turning the mockery of library kid into a banner of pride. At first only Aisha joined him, but slowly others came. Miguel Lopez, the mechanic's son who wanted to learn Latin for seminary school. Sarah Nguyen, a coder like Aisha, curious about Sanskrit. Even a football player who discovered that Old Norse battle poems gave him courage. The club met in a dusty classroom with squeaky chairs, their laughter and practice sessions filling the air with accents from every corner of the world. For Jamal, it was not just a club. It was proof that language could transform pain into purpose. Meanwhile, Ethan Caldwell, who had stood proudly beside Jamal at the colloquium, now faced ghosts of his own past. Headlines hailed his $750 million pledge. But in his heart, he felt the weight of hypocrisy, remembering Clara, his estranged sister who had chosen a life of service in shelters and clinics while he had chased profit and pride. For years he had dismissed her as naive, refusing to attend family dinners, cutting her out of his empire. And now, as he walked into a shelter she managed on Chicago's West Side, the smell of soup and the murmur of the homeless filling the room, he saw in her weary eyes the reflection of all he had failed to value. "You're here because of a boy," Clara said flatly, ladling stew into a bowl without pausing. Ethan nodded, ashamed. "Yes, but I should have been here long before." Clara said nothing more. But the silence cut him deeper than words, forcing him to roll up his sleeves and serve beside her, back at Pinnacle Enterprises. Victor Langston sharpened his knives, unable to shake Jamal in the public eye. He leaked emails claiming Ethan had mismanaged funds, hinting that the foundation was a cover-up for corruption. Headlines screamed, "Scandal at Pinnacle," stocks wavered, and whispers grew among shareholders. But Maria, now stepping into her unexpected role as CEO of the foundation, did not flinch. She ordered transparent audits, opened every ledger, published every figure online, daring anyone to find deceit. When reporters questioned her, she did not speak in the polished language of executives, but in the plain honesty of a woman who had scrubbed toilets for a decade. My son taught me that dignity is not declared. It is practiced daily. These numbers are open for all to see. If you want to know our truth, read it yourself. The public, weary of corporate lies, responded with respect. And the storm Victor had hoped would drown them instead revealed Maria's integrity like a lighthouse in the dark. Still, Jamal's daily life remained a battlefield. The taunts at school did not disappear, though the club gave him strength. A video of him being mocked in the cafeteria went viral, trolls splicing it with clips of him speaking ancient tongues. The caption sneering, 9 languages, 0 friends. Jamal cried in private that night, his young shoulders shaking as Maria held him, whispering, "They fear what they don't understand. But you, my son, you are stronger than fear." He dried his tears, returned to school, and found a message slipped into his locker. Not a slur this time, but a note in halting French. "Merci for showing us courage." He smiled, folded it into his pocket, and knew the club was beginning to change more than just himself. In the evenings, Ethan sometimes visited the library, not as a benefactor but as a student, stumbling over Swahili under Okoye's patient gaze, sweating over Latin verbs while Madame Leclerc corrected his accent. And though the press continued to spin, though Victor continued to plot, the boy who once stood mocked in a marble penthouse was now teaching a billionaire how to bow his head, a school how to value learning, and a city how to see dignity not as charity, but as justice. The day of reckoning arrived not in a classroom or a library, but in the polished heart of Pinnacle Enterprises itself, the round table room where billions were decided and lives often forgotten. The board had gathered, every chair filled with suits and eyes sharpened by profit, and at the head sat Ethan Caldwell, no longer the untouchable titan, but a man under siege, his every move questioned, his loyalty to shareholders challenged, his foundation painted by Victor Langston as a reckless vanity project. "Our stock is slipping," Victor thundered, slamming a report onto the table, "because this man chose to tie our future to a janitor's son and his fantasy foundation. Education clubs and scholarships do not drive quarterly returns. He has betrayed us all." The room buzzed with agreement, nervous murmurs rising as shareholders glanced at one another, calculating risk. But before Ethan could respond, Maria Torres rose, her hands steady though her heart pounded. For the first time in her life, she faced men and women who once walked past her as though she were invisible. Yet now she stood not with a mop in her hand, but with the authority of truth. "You talk of numbers," she said firmly, her accent clear, her words crisp. "Then let us talk of numbers. Since the foundation began, Pinnacle's turnover dropped 42%. Workplace safety incidents fell by 35%, and job applicants surged by 150%. Those are not fantasies, those are facts." She handed out the transparent audits she had insisted upon, the documents Victor had hoped would never see daylight. And silence fell as charts and figures spoke louder than his accusations. "When people feel dignity," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger, "they work not because they fear losing their job, but because they believe in what they are building. That is why Pinnacle is growing, not shrinking. And that is why your revolt is not about shareholders. It is about pride." For a moment, Victor faltered, but his cunning smile returned quickly. "Pride, perhaps. Or perhaps this is about accountability. Ask yourself, is this company led by data or by sentiment?" But before the room could swing back into doubt, Jamal stepped forward, though only 15. He stood with the same courage he had carried through the broken glass at the colloquium. "My name is Jamal Torres," he said quietly, but the quiet carried across the room. "And I have been called a fraud, a stunt, a library kid, But here is what I know. Words build communities, and communities build companies. Without them, your numbers mean nothing. You want to know if this is sentiment? Ask the janitors who became supervisors. Ask the immigrants who now train new employees. Ask the students who come to our clubs every week, choosing to learn instead of joining gangs. If you think that has no value, then maybe you are the ones who cannot count. The room stilled, the weight of a teenager's truth hanging heavier than any spreadsheet. One shareholder, a woman who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I visited one of the new library branches," she said softly. "I saw employees from our company volunteering there. I saw hope. If this is mismanagement, it is the kind we need." Heads began to nod, slowly at first, then with conviction. Victor's face tightened, the power he had counted on slipping like sand through his fingers. Ethan, watching his empire nearly torn apart, finally rose, but his words carried not the arrogance of a CEO, but the humility of a man transformed. "I built Pinnacle on numbers alone," he admitted, "and in doing so I forgot the names, the faces, the people who made those numbers possible. Jamal reminded me that leadership is not about commanding, it is about listening. Maria reminded me that dignity is not charity, it is justice. If you want a company that chases profit alone, then remove me. But if you want a company that lasts beyond quarterly returns, then stand with us." The boardroom erupted into debate, but the tide had shifted. When the vote was called, Victor's motion collapsed, and Ethan remained. His leadership reaffirmed not by fear, but by vision. Furious, Victor stormed from the room, his shadow lingering like a threat yet unfulfilled. But the struggle was not only in polished towers, outside in the city. A new danger rose when a politician proposed slashing funding for public libraries, dismissing them as relics in the digital age. Jamal, hearing the whispers, refused to stay silent. He organized a town hall, not in a grand auditorium, but in the same South Side library that had once humbled Ethan. The room overflowed with neighbors, students, workers, scholars, and volunteers. One by one they told their stories. Okoye describing how teaching Swahili gave him dignity after rejection. Madame Leclerc explaining how French lessons built community for refugees. Sarah Nguyen demonstrating the coding app that grew from the club Jamal had started. Maria closed the gathering with simple words. "You cannot measure a library by the cost of its lights. You measure it by the light it gives to people's lives." Reporters carried the story. Television cameras captured the standing ovation. And within a week, the funding cuts were withdrawn, the city council conceding that the voice of the people could not be ignored. For Jamal, it was not a victory to boast of, but a reminder that battles would always return, that prejudice would always find new disguises. But for that moment, he had stood again in the line of fire and proved that even in politics, even in profit-driven towers, truth could still be spoken by a boy who once was mocked as just a janitor's son. What began as a spark in a library grew into a movement that stretched across the city, and then far beyond, multiplying faster than even Jamal Torres himself could comprehend within the first year. The Jamal Torres Foundation awarded 200 scholarships to children of service workers, opened 15 library branches in neighborhoods long starved of resources, and brought more than 3,500 learners into classrooms where scratched wooden tables became platforms for dreams. At each opening ceremony, Maria stood at the podium, no longer in a janitor's uniform but in a simple blue dress, speaking not with the polish of politicians, but with the sincerity of a mother who had scrubbed floors for a decade and now held the microphone of change. "This is not charity," she reminded them. "This is justice." The words rang through church basements, school gyms, and community centers, and people listened because they knew her truth. Jamal, though only 15, became the reluctant face of it all. A teenager whose name was chanted by crowds, but who still carried his backpack to school every morning. His homework crammed between speeches and interviews. His evenings filled with teaching younger kids how to say hello in 10 different languages. His friend, Aisha Jackson, once timid in the corner of the classroom, now stood beside him with a laptop and an app she had built that allowed thousands to learn Swahili through games and songs. What started as a side project coded in her bedroom hit 12,000 downloads in 3 months, spreading from Chicago to New York, to Nairobi, to Port-au-Prince. Proof that even a girl who once thought her voice too quiet could echo across continents. Ethan Caldwell, once the embodiment of cold corporate pride, now humbled himself week after week at Clara's shelter, serving soup and learning names: Juan, Deborah, Abdul, Clarice, each name spoken aloud as if healing the silence he had once inflicted by overlooking the people who carried his empire. "I used to know the numbers," he confessed to Clara one night, wiping down tables, "but I never knew the names. Now I am learning." She nodded, not ready to forgive entirely, but recognizing the sincerity in his hands, in his presence. Yet as the foundation's reach grew, so too did the shadows of resistance. Victor Langston, bruised by his failure in the boardroom revolt, launched one final attack, leaking false documents that claimed millions had vanished from the Foundation's accounts. Headlines once again screamed scandal, reporters demanded answers, and skeptics circled like vultures. But Maria, steady as ever, called a press conference, standing at a wooden lectern with Jamal and Aisha at her side. She released every receipt, every transaction, every audit for the public to see. "If you seek lies," she said, her voice clear, "you will not find them here. What you will find are scholarships, our books, our meals, our lives changed. That is our balance sheet. The transparency silenced critics, and the truth shone brighter than Victor's lies." Jamal, watching his mother command a room once reserved for executives, felt a surge of pride. He knew now that her strength was the true foundation of everything they had built. Meanwhile, the language club at Jamal's school exploded in size. What began as 3 students crowded around a dusty desk grew to dozens filling the library, chanting greetings in Swahili, Japanese, Spanish, and Arabic, their voices rising above the echoes of lockers once covered in slurs. Even the bullies who had mocked him found themselves curious, creeping into meetings not out of kindness, but out of intrigue, only to leave with new words on their tongues, humbled by the realization that learning could belong to them too. Jamal's mantra spread: 9 tongues, 1 truth, lift others, painted on murals, printed on t-shirts, whispered in classrooms, across the city. Children from neighborhoods long dismissed as hopeless found power in words, while parents wept watching their sons and daughters hold books in languages they had never dreamed of learning. Aisha, once shy, now spoke at conferences, her Swahili app praised as both innovative and empowering, while Jamal stood beside her translating questions into French or Japanese, the two of them embodying a future where technology and language served not the wealthy alone, but the forgotten. Ethan, though still a billionaire, no longer sought headlines but spent quiet hours teaching Latin verbs to teenagers at the library, laughing at his own mistakes, humbled each time Jamal corrected him with patience. Clara, watching from the corner, saw her brother at last as a man changed, not perfect, not redeemed entirely, but walking a path she had once feared he would never take, and through it all. Victor raged in silence, his last scandal collapsing under the weight of Maria's unshakable integrity, his influence shrinking as even shareholders began to whisper that his obsession with destroying Jamal had blinded him to progress. He resigned quietly, his name fading into the background. A bitter footnote in the story of a city rising. For Jamal. The triumph was never about Victor, never about humiliating Ethan, but about the quiet victories. The janitor who became an operations manager, the immigrant who found work teaching, the girl who built an app in her bedroom and changed how thousands learned. One evening, as he walked home past the same apartment building where threats had once been scribbled on his door, he saw children chalking words on the sidewalk. Hello in Arabic, peace in Swahili, hope in Spanish, and he smiled. Knowing the movement was no longer his alone, the multiplication was happening everywhere, unstoppable, undeniable, proof that knowledge when shared did not divide but multiplied, spreading dignity like light through windows once dark. 18 months after the day Ethan Caldwell first mocked him in the marble penthouse, Jamal Torres stood on a stage built not of steel and glass, but of wood and hope. Inside a transformed hall of Pinnacle Enterprises, the round table room that had once symbolized power, now redesigned with photographs of workers, students, and families whose lives had been changed by the foundation. Banners in 9 languages hung across the walls, each carrying the same message: dignity practiced daily. And in the front row sat 25 former janitors, men and women who had once been invisible in the corporate corridors, but who were now dressed in suits and gowns, waiting to receive certificates that named them operations associates, graduates of the first program of the Jamal Torres Foundation. Maria walked to the podium, her voice steady, her shoulders squared. No trace left of the woman who had once bent her back over Pinnacle's marble floors. For 10 years I worked here with no one knowing my name, she said, the microphone amplifying her truth. But today I stand before you as CEO of a foundation that belongs not to me, not to Ethan, not even to Jamal, but to every worker who was ever overlooked, every student who was ever told they could not learn, every family who was told dignity was too expensive. Applause rose, not polite, but thunderous, rolling through the hall as the graduates wept, their children cheering, their spouses holding cameras high. Ethan sat quietly in the second row, his hands folded, a different man than the arrogant mogul he once had been, his eyes wet as he looked toward Clara, who sat beside him, at peace now with her brother's transformation. He leaned toward her and whispered, "You were right all along." And she squeezed his hand, not needing words to acknowledge that the journey from arrogance to humility had been long and painful, but worth every step. Then Jamal, now 15, approached the microphone. He was taller than before, his voice deeper, but still carrying the calm fire that had once silenced a room of protesters. "I stand here not because I was the smartest, not because I was the strongest," he began, pausing as cameras flashed. "I stand here because my mother taught me that dignity is not something declared once and forgotten. It is something practiced daily. When they mocked me as a library kid, I answered with books. When they tried to break windows, I answered with words. When they called my mother invisible, she answered by leading." The hall stilled, every eye on him, every heart leaning forward. Jamal pointed to the far wall where a framed poster hung, the same one once defaced with racial slurs in his school locker. The insults had not been erased, but covered with gold leaf in the Japanese style of kintsugi. Cracks repaired, but stains left visible. "We keep this here," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because brokenness is part of our story. We do not hide the stains. We learn from them." For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that carries more power than any cheer. And then the applause erupted again, filling the room like a flood of light. Outside the building, Chicago's skyline glowed against the evening sky, no longer cold steel alone, but lit with murals painted by students from the foundation. Words in Spanish, Swahili, Japanese, Arabic, declaring that knowledge belonged to all. Aisha stood beside Jamal, her laptop under her arm. Her Swahili app now used in schools across the Midwest. She whispered to him, "We did it." And he smiled, shaking his head. "No, we're just beginning." Ethan, humbled, stepped to the podium one last time, not as CEO of Pinnacle, not even as benefactor, but as a man who had learned the hardest lesson of his life. "This foundation must not be led by me," he said, looking at Maria with respect. "And so today I step down as chair and pass leadership fully into her hands. I will serve, not command." Maria nodded, accepting not as a gift, but as justice, and the crowd cheered her name. Victor Langston, once the shadow in every room, was gone now. His resignation a forgotten headline. His schemes dissolved into irrelevance. The story belonged to Jamal, to Maria, to every worker who had once been silenced. And as the ceremony ended, the graduates lifted their certificates high, children danced in the aisles, and Jamal led Ethan to a small table at the back where a Sanskrit verse was inscribed on wood. "To know the word is to serve the world." Jamal handed Ethan a copy of the verse, challenging him to read it aloud. Ethan stumbled, mispronounced, faltered, and then smiled as Jamal corrected him gently, just as he had in the library months before. It was no longer humiliation, but learning. And in that simple act, a billionaire and a janitor's son sat side by side, teacher and student, proof that power is not measured in money, but in humility. Chicago that night pulsed with something new. Not the hum of profit alone, but the heartbeat of a city learning to read itself anew. Its story rewritten not on marble floors, but in classrooms, libraries, and the daily dignity of ordinary people made extraordinary by hope. Thank you for watching. Tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together we can keep these stories alive.